if you lived in a medieval village, there was one knock you feared more than bandits, more than disease, even more than the executioner. Because when the tax collector arrived, someone always paid, and sometimes the payment was blood. Tonight, I'll show you why being a medieval tax collector was one of the most dangerous jobs in history. A tax collector carried no sword, only a ledger of names. But that ledger held more power than steel. To the villagers, he was hunger. He was debt. He was punishment. And when he walked into town, whispers spread faster than flames, shutters slammed. Mothers pulled children inside. Men reached for weapons, because no one feared the king's soldiers as much as they feared the man who counted their coins.
Here he comes! Look at him sweat! Betrayer!
The moment he stepped into town, the village seemed to shrink away. Doors shut, shutters slammed. People hid their faces, as if hoping the man with the ledger might overlook them. For families already living on the edge of hunger, even a handful of coins meant the difference between surviving the winter or watching their children starve. Every payment was a wound, cut deeper by the king's demands. To understand why the tax collector walked in fear, you have to understand what his arrival meant. In medieval life, every grain of wheat, every chicken, every copper coin was survival. And the moment he stepped into a village, people knew one thing: the crown wanted more. The collector would search barns, look through grain sacks, and always find a way to raise the debt. For a tax collector, danger didn't come from the roads. It came from the people. Every debt he recorded, every coin he demanded, carved another enemy into the village. And some of those enemies were willing to spill blood to erase their names from his ledger. As the collector neared the village gates, the evening sun dipped behind the rooftops. Mothers gathered their children inside. Merchants slammed their shutters closed. Nobody wanted to be seen. His arrival wasn't a visit, it was a warning. And the village felt it like a cold wind. Inside the village, the silence felt heavier than the evening air. The collector hadn't even reached the market square, yet his presence already pressed on every wall, every shutter, every breath. Windows that were once open to the breeze now stood cracked only by a finger's width, just enough for a frightened eye to watch the road. The houses were close here, leaning inward like they were trying to whisper to each other. Even the livestock sensed the tension. A lone chicken scratched nervously near a doorway before darting into the shadows. No one wanted to be seen. Not today. Not by him. Every villager knew the routine: hide early, stay quiet, pretend not to exist. Some families had coins ready in a small cloth pouch, trembling in their hands. Others had nothing left to give, and their fear was the deepest of all. As the collector's footsteps approached, the village seemed to tighten around itself. The wind carried dry dust down the narrow street, drifting across empty doorsteps where people usually sat and talked. Now there was only waiting, and the dread of the knock that always came sooner or later. Behind one of the doors, a family huddled in silence. The wooden boards trembled slightly, not from the wind, but from the mother's tightening grip on the latch. She pressed her ear against the wood, listening for footsteps. Her children sat on the floor behind her, clutching a small pouch that held the last of their coins. The street outside was quiet, too quiet. Even the usual hum of evening life had vanished, replaced by a nervous stillness that clung to the air like dust. Every family in the village knew this fear, the deep ache of waiting behind locked doors, hoping the collector's shadow would pass their home without pausing. But hope was always thin in times like these. As the collector moved deeper into the village, his footsteps grew slower, heavier. He wasn't walking with the urgency of a messenger or the pride of a nobleman. He moved like a man carrying a burden he could never set down. Every step was measured, every pause deliberate. The villagers listened from behind their doors. They could hear the faint thud of his boots on the packed dirt, coming closer, stopping, then starting again. Some prayed quietly. Others held their breath, hoping he would simply pass them by. Everyone knew what came next. The knock. One single strike against a wooden door that could change the fate of a family. The collector didn't yell, he didn't threaten, he didn't need to. His presence alone forced obedience, and somewhere on that quiet street, he finally slowed to a stop. A moment of stillness settled over the homes, and the entire village waited for the sound they dreaded most. Inside the home, silence wrapped around the family like a blanket. The mother pressed her hand against the door, feeling the cold seep through the wood. Her children sat behind her, clutching their small pouch of coins so tightly, their knuckles turned white. The air felt thick, unmoving, as if the entire world was holding its breath with them. The weight of fate rested on the other side of that thin wooden barrier. The collector stood still in the center of the narrow street, his shadow stretching across the doorway of a small house. He didn't knock immediately. He listened first, the soft creak of wood behind the walls, the faint shuffle of someone holding their breath. Even silence can betray a family desperate to remain unseen. The village held its breath with them. Every shutter, every crack, every doorway watched without daring to move. The collector's presence cast a weight that settled on the entire lane, pressing down like a cold hand around a throat. Then came the sound the villagers feared most, a slow raise of his hand, a moment of hesitation, and the heavy thud of knuckles against the door. Not loud, not violent, but final. A knock that didn't ask a question. It demanded an answer. Behind the walls, someone shifted, someone who had hoped he would pass them by. But tonight, their luck had run thin. There were many reasons a family might refuse to answer the collector's knock. Fear, pride, poverty, or the simple truth that some had nothing left to surrender. But medieval law had no patience for excuses, and neither did the man standing outside their door. The collector lowered his hand and listened. No footsteps, no voices. Only the faint tremble of someone inside wishing they were invisible. His breath left him in a slow cloud, as the last light of the day clung to the rooftops. He wasn't cruel by choice, but he was relentless by duty. The village knew what came next. If a home ignored the first knock, the second was never gentle. The collector stepped closer, placing his palm flat against the wood. He wasn't trying to break in. He wanted the family to feel that pressure, to know he was not leaving. Refusal came with consequences, fines doubled, goods seized, or sometimes the village reeve summoned to intervene. And behind this particular door, the tension tightened like a rope pulled too far. The house was silent, but silence, in times like these, was its own confession. The pressure of his hand against the door sent a shiver through the boards. Inside, the air thickened with dread. Whoever stood there could feel the weight of both the law and the man enforcing it. The day was nearly gone, but the consequences of this moment would last far longer. And in that fading light, the door seemed thinner than ever, a fragile barrier against a reality no one could escape. The collector continued down the narrow lane, moving with the certainty of someone who had walked this same path countless times before. But tonight, something felt different. The village wasn't merely quiet, it was hollow. Fear had drained the place of its breath, its rhythm, its life. All that remained were the small traces of panic left behind in the rush to hide. A door curtain swayed where someone had slipped inside moments earlier. A wooden bowl still rocked on its edge in the dirt, as if dropped mid-step. The remnants of everyday life clung to the silence like ghosts. Combined, they told a story far louder than voices ever could. The collector paused beside a shutter cracked just enough to reveal a flicker of candlelight. No eyes looked out, but he felt them. The weight of unspoken dread seeped from every window. He was accustomed to resistance, but entire neighborhoods do not hold their breath unless something has pushed them past the point of hope. He stood there for a long moment, letting the silence settle. Tonight would not be an ordinary night, and the village knew it long before he did. The house wasn't empty, it was interrupted. The stool lying on its side, the cloth dragged across the floor, the cup still spilling its last drop. None of it had settled yet. Whatever had happened here happened fast, and fear had left its fingerprints on every object. The silence inside felt sharp, as if the air itself was waiting for someone to return, or someone to enter. The collector stepped deeper into the abandoned room, careful not to disturb the objects left behind. The air inside was warm, still carrying the breath of whoever had fled. Something had happened here, something that didn't match the usual pattern of families hiding from taxes. This wasn't fear of a knock, this was fear of something else entirely. The overturned stool, the scattered cloth, the candle fighting against the shadows. Each detail spoke of a struggle of some kind. Not violent enough to leave marks on the walls, but sudden enough to tear a person from their routine. A bowl still steamed faintly on the table, untouched, as if someone had been called away mid-meal, or forced. The floor carried faint signs of movement, a drag, a scuff, a pattern of disturbed dust that didn't belong to footsteps alone. And the deeper he looked, the more the house whispered a warning he had never heard in this village before. The strange mark on the floor was only the beginning. As the collector crouched beside it, the candle behind him flickered twice, then leaned unnaturally sideways, as if the flame itself were reacting to something in the room. The air grew colder, not the kind of cold that comes from a draft, but the kind that feels intentional, as if it had followed something here. He traced the edge of the circular impression with his fingertips. Whatever had been placed there was not a bowl or a stool. The weight distribution was wrong. The dust had been pushed outward in a spiral, not downward. This was not an object dropped or set aside. It was lowered with care, then taken away with urgency. A faint glint caught his eye. Something metallic lay half buried in the disturbed dirt near the far wall. He reached for it slowly, as if expecting the shadows to react. When he cleared the dust away, a small iron seal revealed itself. Not one used by villagers. This was the kind used by reeves, magistrates, or worse, collectors like himself. But he had never seen this seal before, and he knew every seal issued in this county. Every single one. That meant only one thing. Someone else had been collecting here. Someone who had no right to. Someone who had reason to hide their tracks. And whatever they took from this house, they were not finished yet. The collector stood up slowly, the iron seal heavy in his hand, but the air heavier still. The house felt different now, almost as if it were leaning inward, listening, waiting. The candle on the table snapped with a sudden pop, throwing a wave of shadows across the room. For a heartbeat, it felt like the darkness behind the walls was breathing. He had seen fear in villages before, but never a house that carried it like this. Dust drifted in spirals long after he stopped moving, as if disturbed by something only moments before he arrived. The wooden beams groaned softly overhead, not from age, but from pressure, from weight, a weight that was no longer present. As he stepped back toward the center of the room, the floor creaked, but not beneath his foot. A second, softer creak followed his movement, delayed by a breath echoing from the darker end of the house. It didn't sound like a person hiding. It sounded like the echo of someone leaving, too recently for the old wood to forget. A sudden gust forced its way through the thin cracks of the door, blowing the candle nearly horizontal. Papers fluttered, dust exploded into the air, the shadows stretched wide as if trying to escape. And in that violent flicker of light, he saw something etched into the wood by the doorway. Shallow, carved hurriedly, almost invisible. Not a symbol of prayer, not a mark of trade. It was a warning, a message left by someone who did not have time to speak their last words out loud. The carved mark looked rushed, jagged lines, uneven depth, a message scratched into the wood by a shaking hand. The collector leaned closer, letting the candle's failing glow reveal every splinter. The symbol wasn't one he recognized from taxes, trade, or any village customs. This was something older, something people drew only when they were out of options. The candle snapped again, harder this time. The flame spat sideways, nearly dying before erupting back to life in a frantic sway. Shadows lashed across the walls like living things struggling to escape the house, and beneath the crackling flame, the beams overhead groaned, too loudly to be just the wind. He stepped back, scanning the room. Dust drifted in spirals he hadn't created. The floor creaked a second time, soft and delayed, as if something else had stepped where he stood a moment before. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was expectant, watching him. His eyes caught something beyond the doorway. Not movement, but absence of light. A patch of darkness deeper than the rest, clinging to the wall where the carved warning pointed. The air grew thicker as he approached, resisting his presence like water around a sinking weight. The closer he came, the colder the wood beneath his hand became. The carved lines felt sharper, wrong. And then he noticed it. Dried dust gathered at the bottom edge of the mark, disturbed recently, as if the symbol had been touched or traced by someone else. Someone who had been here moments before he entered the house. Whoever left the warning didn't carve it for the collector. They carved it for whoever, or whatever, followed him inside. The collector stared at the thin black gap between the floorboards, watching the candlelight die the moment it touched the darkness inside it. The shadow didn't behave like a shadow. It didn't bend, it didn't soften, and it didn't move with the flame. It simply absorbed everything. The light, the warmth, even the air around it. He crouched lower, trying to see deeper into the gap, but the darkness swallowed detail after detail until the wood around it blurred into nothingness. A chill rose from the floor, sliding up his arms like a breath exhaled by the earth itself. It wasn't the cold of night. It was the cold of emptiness trying to spread. The house creaked again. Not above him this time, but beneath. A slow, dragging groan that vibrated through the floorboards like something old shifting its weight. Dust jumped on the surface, scattering outward from the crack in tiny bursts, as if the boards were pulsing. The candle held in his hand snapped sharply, not from wind, but from pressure. The flame stretched sideways, almost horizontal, as if something beneath the floor had inhaled. In that stretched moment of warped light, he saw it. The disturbed dust along the edges of the crack wasn't just displaced. It was compressed, pushed inward, drawn towards the darkness. He took a step back, but the floor answered with another groan, louder, longer, more deliberate. It followed his retreat, creaking an instant after he moved. The boards weren't settling. They were responding. The message carved in the doorframe wasn't a warning to stay out. It wasn't about danger approaching. It was a warning to never step where he just had. The collector stepped out of the house, letting the stale, heavy air behind him slip back into the darkness. But outside, the night greeted him with something worse. The village was silent, but not empty. The kind of silence that carries breath. The kind that watches. The wind had changed. It blew from the west, dragging a thin mist across the narrow paths. The torches on the street flickered weakly, their flames bending as if pointing towards something moving unseen. Doors were shut tight, but every shutter had a single line of darkness between the boards, always facing him. He walked deeper into the lane, and the earth beneath his boots felt wrong. packed unevenly, disturbed recently. A cluster of footprints overlapped in the dirt, circling the well at the centre of the village. They weren't frantic or scattered. They were organised, waiting. A metallic clang echoed between the houses. Not a tool dropping, not a pot falling. A blade being sheathed or drawn. The collector's heartbeat slowed, not from fear, but recognition. Someone was out here with him. Someone who knew he was coming. Someone who moved in the dark better than the villagers ever could. He looked toward the well, and the mist there curled unnaturally around the stones, hugging the ground like a low cloud. Beneath the fog, he could just make out a trail, a drag mark cutting through the dirt, heading toward the far edge of the village. Whatever was taken from the house had been carried into the night. But the collector wasn't alone on that path. He could feel it in the cold air pressing against his back. Whoever carved the warning inside wasn't just scared. They were running from someone. And that someone was closer than the mist allowed him to see. The collector stepped toward the well, the fog curling around his boots like the fingers of someone trying to slow him down. The footprints circling the stones were too fresh, too many, and far too organised. This wasn't panic. This was a meeting point, a place where someone stood long enough to make the earth remember him. The torch above him hissed as if reacting to something he couldn't see. The flame bent sharply, almost parallel to the ground, pointing down the narrow alley behind him. Not blown, pushed. The kind of movement caused by a body moving in the mist, just out of sight. He turned slowly. The alley was empty, but the fog there swirled in a shape he recognized. The outline of someone who had just stepped away. Dust shifted where the ground had been disturbed. A faint metallic sound rang softly against the stones, sharper than the earlier one inside the house. This time, not an echo, a warning. He walked toward the alley, and the silence thickened. Every closed shutter felt like an eye holding its breath. Every shadow leaned towards him. The mist parted slightly ahead, revealing something half buried in the dirt. Not dropped, planted, waiting to be found. It was a small iron buckle, torn from a belt in a struggle. Fresh dirt clung to its edge, and next to it, smeared into the mud, was a single tread mark. Human, heavy, deliberate, someone strong, someone who had dragged their victim through the night toward the far edge of the village. But as he knelt to examine it, he felt the air shift, the unmistakable pressure of someone standing behind him, not moving, not speaking, just watching, close enough that the fog bent around their shape, but far enough that the darkness kept their face hidden. For the first time that night, the collector wasn't studying the village. The village was studying him. The collector didn't move. He didn't breathe. The fog behind him curled in slow, deliberate waves, as if someone was exhaling into the night. He felt the weight of eyes he could not see, not distant, not wandering, but locked directly onto the space between his shoulder blades. A soft sound broke the silence, a single grain of dirt falling, hitting the ground behind him with impossible clarity. Then another, and another. Like footsteps trying too hard to be quiet. The rustle of fabric brushed through the mist, low and close, carried by a breath of cold air that pressed against his back. He turned just enough to see the edge of the alley. Nothing stood there. But the fog parted, not by wind, not by chance. It opened in a narrow path, as though making room for something to move through. A shape? A body? A shadow with weight? No. Something worse. Someone who moved with purpose. The drag mark beside the well suddenly made sense. Someone hadn't fled the village in panic. They had been taken. And the one who took them was still here. Still hunting. Still dragging their prize through the night like a wolf, dragging prey just far enough to feast without interruption. He took one step toward the path. The mist slammed shut. The torches around the village flickered violently, one going out entirely. The darkness swallowed half the lane. The remaining flame bent sideways so hard it nearly touched the wall, pointing behind him, always behind him. And then he heard it, a slow, deliberate inhale in the fog. Not animal, not wind. A human breath drawn with patience, with confidence, with ownership. Someone was close enough to kill him, close enough to touch him, close enough that he could hear their breath trembling through the night. But they weren't attacking. Not yet. They wanted him to know they were there. The collector followed the footprints until they simply ended, mid-sentence, mid-breath, mid-stride. The fog swallowed the last impression in the dirt, leaving nothing but an unfinished story. He crouched low, examining the edges. The footprint wasn't faded. It was cut, sharp, clean, as if the person had been lifted straight out of the earth. A low groan rippled through the wooden beams of the nearest house, not from age, not from wind, but from weight. Something pressed against the wall from the inside, a slow bending of old timber under a force that did not belong to the quiet night. A shutter slammed shut somewhere behind him. Another rattled violently across the lane, banging like a fist against iron hinges. The fog reacted a moment before he felt it, swirling inward toward the center of the village, spinning in a tightening spiral. Dust lifted off the ground as if gravity had been softened. The torches, every one of them, bent at once toward the well. Flames nearly horizontal. The entire village exhaled in a single, violent breath. He took a step back, but the darkness between the houses pulsed. A quick contraction, like the shadows themselves were narrowing. Something moved behind him. A sound so quiet it almost wasn't real. A single stone rolling across the path. Another. Another. Tapped toward him one at a time, as if someone were pushing them with the tip of a boot. He turned. Nothing there. But the sound continued, circling him. The stones moved in a slow loop around his feet, guided by something he could not see. A game. A warning. A boundary carefully drawn. The collector realized then that he was no longer following someone. He was surrounded by them. Whoever dragged the victim through the night was not alone. Whoever breathed inside the fog was not acting in panic. This was coordinated, calculated, waiting, and the moment he stepped inside their circle, he had already stepped into their trap. The drag trail vanished into the fog like everything else that night, swallowed, erased, consumed. The collector stepped forward, slow at first, then faster as the mist thickened around him. It wasn't just fog anymore, it had weight, direction, purpose. Every torch around the village bent inward, flames stretching toward the same point as if bowing to something unseen. A soft hum filled the air, a vibration so low it crawled across the skin, shaking dust loose from rooftops. The houses groaned in unison, their old beams tightening like fists closing around secrets. He felt the village shift around him, not physically, but in intent. Doors he walked past earlier now sat slightly ajar. Shutters once closed, now angled just enough to create slits of darkness, all pointed toward him. Not watching. Marking. The stones at his feet trembled. Dust lifted, forming a thin halo around his boots, not rising upward, but pulled sideways, toward the center of the village. The fog churned in a spiral, tightening, tightening, until the entire night felt drawn toward a single, suffocating point. He turned to run, but the path behind him folded into shadow, swallowed by the same twisting fog that had taken the footprints. The air thinned, light thinned, even sound thinned. His breath left his chest but did not return, dragged forward by something with far more patience than he had courage. Then he saw it. The circle of stones he'd stepped into earlier was no longer made of stones. The ground had sunk in a perfect ring around him, forming a shallow pit, the kind made not by nature, but by many hands working in silence. A trap older than the village, older than the torchlight, older than the laws he served. A circle made to contain prey. He stumbled back, but the earth shifted with him. The spiral in the fog tightened. The torches went out all at once. And in the single heartbeat of absolute darkness that followed, the collector finally understood why the village hid in silence. It wasn't fear of the night. It was fear of what hunted in it. He was not leaving this place. The night would take him just as it had taken the others. The mist closed around him, and the village breathed its last breath with him.